up this hymn.
Please join me with your ears and your heart as I read our land acknowledgement for Judson Church. Place is more than just a piece of land. It is a piece of who we are. For too long, we have associated this place where Judson Church sits with our European American roots, forgetting the people who called this place home for centuries before us. Minnesota Makoche, land where the waters reflect the sky, and specifically this part of the Twin Cities, is the ancestral home of the Dakota Wakaput people. It is home to their creation stories. It is where they hunted, fished, harvested, and cared for the land, raised families, celebrated life in community, and laid their loved ones to rest. We acknowledge that we, the people, our ancestors and governments, forcibly removed the Wakaput from their ancestral lands through relocation, warfare, execution, imprisonment in concentration camps, starvation, disease, and forced assimilation. Treaties were made and subsequently broken by us. We remember and lament the history of this land. Today, we acknowledge and appreciate our Dakota, Anishinaabe, and other indigenous peoples as neighbors and fellow citizens. We commit to do better by our neighbors, to stand with them and to learn from them as we seek to create a community that sees the Creator's face in everything. Thank you.
Wow.
Thank you, Leslie. I just want to introduce the panelists that we have here with you so you have a little bit of understanding. My name is Travis Norvell. I'm the pastor at Judson, so thank you for coming again. Right here sitting next to me is Reverend Angela. I want to say, you know what, everyone here on the stage, I should say, I've never met in person. There are people that I respect very well and think highly of, and this was a nice way of getting us all together. So thank you for that. I want to say your last name correctly.
I say Denker.
You say Denker?
It's my married name. I got stuck with it.
Okay, yeah. You'll know her from all kinds of things, right? Does the voice sounds familiar? You've heard her on the radio, right? Doing all kinds of things. If she looks familiar, you've seen her on TV, doing interviews. I'm very jealous of this one post she had one time of having to wake up at like 3 a.m. to get ready for the BBC. So that's a cool thing. Author of Red State Christians. If you haven't read the book, please do so. For that. Seated next to her is Reverend Jim Bear Jacobs. He is a co-facilitator, co-leader of the racial justice for the Minnesota Council of Churches. Also leads tours for kind of Native American history sites and history here in the Twin Cities. If you got the Minneapolis Community Ed program, you saw that there was one of these tours for September 30th. Well, it's already sold out. So I hope that you go on one of his tours. It will be filling back up in the spring of 2024. How many of you here have gone to one of the tours by chance? Oh, fantastic. Yeah. So make sure, we still got a lot of people that need to go on. So great. And tonight our author, for this evening, Dr. Robert Jones, author of plenty of books, right? He's one of these guys that you just kind of cringe at. Let me explain to it, right? I mean, you want somebody like that. Okay, somebody can be a really good writer, sure, okay. You don't ever expect them to be like a really nice person, and kind of, affable, but he fulfills he checks all those boxes. So for the rest of us, it's kind of, but that's okay. Great person, great human being, writes for, really writes for public, for us to engage these topics today. I'll just say this before he reads. Will Campbell, who was a late Baptist minister, said, never in the Gospels does Jesus ever say, take up your cross and relax. And I think that Robert's book makes us think again. Yeah, we're not here to relax. We got work to do. And take us on that journey, Robert.
Great. Well, thank you for all of you for coming out tonight. And I am Reverend Jim Bear and Jacobs and I have had a chance to be together, but I have not been with Reverend Denker or Reverend Norvell before. So it's nice to get out of our little social media boxes and our Substack boxes, as the case may be. So I will just plug, let me just plug real quick, Angela's Substack newsletter. If you're not subscribed, you should subscribe. And definitely you've got to go on the tour. It was actually one of the, for those who've gotten to it, I talk about it in the book. It was a very moving, really life-changing experience going on the tour. So when is the next one, before we go any further? Do you know?
Well, they're pretty much booked out.
All right.
So, in next spring.
Okay, next spring. Yes, that's when I went. I went in May, early May. Beautiful. It was amazing. But I thought I would start tonight. Don't worry, I'm not going to do a lot of reading, but I do want to read a passage that kicks off the book, actually, because it's a Minnesota story. The book has 3 locations in it: the Mississippi Delta, Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Minnesota. And the lead story that I think illustrates what I'm up to and the journey that I'm on in the book is actually a journey story. So I thought I'd start with that, and then we'll kind of see where we go from here. On May 4th, 1863, the steamboat Northerner pushed up the Mississippi River from St. Louis, bound for Fort Snelling, a military outpost north of St. Paul, Minnesota. Just a few miles into the journey, Captain Alfred J. Woods encountered a large handmade craft adrift in the strong currents. Aboard were 76 African Americans, 40 men, 10 women, and 26 children. The leader of this determined group was Robert Hickman, who was attempting to free himself, along with his family and neighbors, from enslavement on a plantation in Boone County, Missouri. Hickman, a preacher who could both read and write, had seen newspaper accounts of President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation 4 months earlier. Although the proclamation did not apply to Missouri because it was under Union control, this news nonetheless inspired him to begin making plans to escape north. The Hickman party aimed to reach free soil by way of the river, which was by then safely patrolled by the Union Army. They embarked under cover of darkness on the moonless night of May 3rd, but because their makeshift craft was not equipped with sails or oars, they drifted for a day in the wrong direction before encountering the Northerner. Seeing the floundering party with so many children on board, Captain Woods asked if they needed assistance. Sympathetic to their plight and knowing that the strains of the Civil War had left Minnesota with a labor shortage, Woods ordered the raft to be securely tied to the steamboat and offered to take them as far as its final destination. Neither Woods nor Hickman anticipated the vitriol that awaited them. On May 5th, the Northerner approached the levee in Lower Town on the outskirts of St. Paul. As local dock workers, mostly Irish, caught sight of the self-emancipated African Americans, commonly referred to as contraband by whites, on the trailing raft, they became increasingly agitated, seeing them as competitors for jobs. As word spread, a threatening crowd gathered on the levee. The commotion was so great that St. Paul police arrived on the scene. But after assessing the situation, they sided with the mob and threatened to arrest not the Irish rabble-rousers, but the black asylum seekers, should they disembark. Captain Woods ordered the boat with his trailing raft to steam on to Fort Snelling. There, Hickman and his party came ashore without incident on May 5th, but they were met with an unexpected sight. Hundreds of disheveled Native Americans were huddled together, forcibly assembled near the docks. The desperate and anxious crowd they encountered were part of an original group numbering more than 1,600, mostly women, children, and elderly Dakota people who had been held under armed guard all winter following the Dakota War of the year before, in a miserable encampment in the lowland area below Fort Snelling. Unbeknownst to them, Minnesota government officials and military leaders were awaiting the spring thaw that would allow for their mass deportation downriver from their ancient homelands to a bleak reservation in Nebraska territory. By the time the ice finally melted and the river's levels rose, hundreds had died. A group of 770 Dakota people had been shipped off the day before on another steamer, the Davenport. Having set the Hickman party safely ashore and unloaded the wagons and supplies for the military fort, Captain Woods ordered preparations to receive his next cargo. 547 Dakota people, who he was transporting for the fee of $25 per head plus 10 cents a day for sustenance. Soldiers from Fort Snelling herded the ragtag remnant aboard the Northerner, quote, like so many cattle, unquote, as one observer put it. As they pulled away, a local minister's wife remarked, "May God have mercy on them, for they can expect none from man." Neither Hickman nor his companions, nor the Dakota people, would have had the perspective to realize they were witnessing a momentous final chapter of both chattel slavery in the U.S. and, quote, Indian removal, end quote, in Minnesota. They would not have grasped the paradox the two groups represented that afternoon on the banks of the Mississippi River. That the end of bondage for Hickman's band also marked the last vestige of sovereignty for the Dakota people. And they would certainly have been unaware that, in the closing weeks of 1862, just 5 months earlier, President Lincoln was simultaneously considering two documents that would dramatically change the fates of each group: a warrant for the mass execution of 38 Dakota men and the Emancipation Proclamation. This encounter on May 5th, 1863 contains multiple narrative streams, each of which tells a different story about America. The question is, which do we follow? Do we tell the story of Fort Snelling, the military outpost established to protect westward expansion of settler colonialism? Do we embark back down the Mississippi River to Missouri and the story of enslaved Africans in the South? Do we push upriver from St. Paul to its headwaters and stories of indigenous peoples populating this land for millennia? Or do we portage east, and cross the larger waters connected to the homelands of Europeans who first set foot on these shores just a few hundred years ago? Each narrative pushes back to a different beginning.
Whenever you feel so moved by it. Thank you, Rob, for that. And do you want to just talk a little bit about maybe the origins of this book, how it came about, and we can respond to that?
Yeah, this is the third book I've written about the kind of entanglement of white supremacy and Christianity in America. I did not set out to write 3 books on white supremacy and Christianity, but I just realized I hadn't quite wrestled it to the ground. I'm still not sure I have really kind of untangled the mess. So the first book was called The End of White Christian America in 2016, and there I was really trying to, essentially what got me into the book, honestly, was, so I grew up a Southern Baptist in Mississippi, in Jackson, Mississippi, and have extended family that goes back 6 generations in Middle Georgia on both sides of my family. In fact, my siblings and I are the first in 6 generations not to live in either Bibb County or Twiggs County, Georgia. Right, so deep, deep roots there. And the question that got me in that book was essentially this question of like, why are my people so angry? Why are they so angry? Why are they so fearful? Was really the question I was trying to answer. And my day job at Public Religion Research Institute, I crunch a lot of numbers, do a lot of demographic studies, public opinion, social change. And so I basically just looked, and one of the things that I think helps explain it, and helps explain, I think, the current context, is the change in demographics in the country. And in particular, that we have gone from being a majority white Christian country, demographically speaking, to one that is no longer a majority white Christian country. And that's happened only in the last 20 years. Right? So if you go back to this kind of very symbolic event, the election of our first African-American president in 2008, when Barack Obama was running for president, the country was 54% white and Christian. By the end of his second term, it was 47% white and Christian. Today, it's 42%.
Wow.
So this is a very significant slide in a fairly short amount of time, demographically speaking. Typically, you don't see these kinds of shifts. And it's a combination of racial shifts in the country, but also disaffiliation, particularly by younger white Christians leaving white Christian churches. So that was kind of setting the stage. And then in 2000, I wrote a book called White Too Long. It was essentially a memoir, and kind of part sociology, part memoir, and looking at my own family's history, so tracing that history back to the 19th century. And the 2 documents there that I think stand out to me are, I have a family Bible from that family that first came to Georgia in 1815. And the Bible was printed that year in 1815. It's to my ancestor Pleasant Moon inscribed on the thing. And in between the Old and New Testaments are 3 generations of genealogical records, right, from that first family that came down from Georgia. And this had been handed down on my mother's side of the family, down, and it's now, my mother gave it to me when I went to seminary. And that's always been a prized family possession and a sign that religion and Christianity and faith was really important, right, to our family. It's in fact the oldest object of any kind that exists in our family. And then I was doing some genealogical research and I came upon another document from the same family. In fact, it was the namesake of my direct ancestor, Pleasant Moon. It was his uncle, and it was his estate settlement. But it's part of the same group that came down together. You probably know where this is going. I know in those estate settlements, they list all the, it literally says at the top of the page, the goods and chattels of Pleasant Moon deceased, 1815. And when you look in there, it begins with one bay mare, one feather bed, those kinds of things. And about 3 lines down, there are 4 human beings. A woman named Naomi at $400. Bird, a boy, at $150. Eliza at $300, right? Listed out there. And then it goes right back to 4 head of sheep, 6 chairs and a table, like just runs on down. And what struck me about this is that these 2 documents, right, tell 2 very different stories about my family, right? One that I thought I knew, and then what really I think what I was wrestling with in White Too Long, that book, was how those 2 things could hold together in one family, right? That they could see no conflict between enslaving other people on the basis of the color of their skin and holding on to a Christian faith. And so in this book, I'm really tracing it back even further. I realized I kind of had parked it in the 19th century, which is kind of where my family story, as far back as I can trace it with confidence. But that was not by any stretch the beginning of the story of the entanglement of white supremacy and Christianity. And actually through interactions like with Reverend Jim Bear Jacobs and others, realized that the story that often doesn't get told, even when we're telling the story about enslavement and segregation, is the story of our relationship with the original inhabitants of this land. That somehow gets siloed over into its own story. So in this book, I'm really trying to tell that opening story, I'm trying to hold these 2 histories together in a way, and maybe one way to succinctly sum it up here is, even well-meaning white Christians would often talk in just a couple of generations back about the so-called Negro problem or the so-called Indian problem, right, that we good white Christians needed to solve. And what I think one way of putting it is that I realize that if you hold those 2 things together and the historical record together, you realize that, behind the Negro problem and the Indian problem is a white Christian problem. And that's really what this book's about.
I wanted to respond to all that because that opening chapter, that opening of the book, as I was reading it today, it really struck me, and it brought up a question too that I wanted to ask you tonight. So when I began reading, I'm 38 years old. I grew up here in Minnesota. I'm a Lutheran pastor. So the other most shameful line that I read in the book was seeing that there were no Lutheran clergy documented as protesting the lynchings in Duluth. But anyway, as I began to read, I think growing up white in Minnesota, there is a temptation, and I think there's a temptation for many people who are around my age to distance ourselves from the sins of the past. And so to think, and it's even, I think it was even taught that way a little bit in our schools, that, this happened in the South, and then we learn about indigenous peoples, but we often don't learn, we learn as though it's something in the past. And so there's this desire to sort of distance ourselves, and so you start to, I think even a lot of well-meaning, progressive white Christians will go into reading books like yours thinking about we're learning about someone else. And as soon as I got into your book, even though you're from Mississippi, you're Southern Baptist, so those are the people that it's really easy for people like me to say, oh, they're the problem. And you hear that a lot in white mainline circles. I start to read, and all of a sudden it's St. Paul, Minnesota. It's Duluth, and it's Boone County, Missouri. And I'm a graduate of the University of Missouri, which is in Boone County. So all of a sudden, I'm seeing myself in the book, and forced to reckon with, I think the other thing too, a lot of people maybe my age, and you hear this argument a lot when people want to fight against critical race theory being taught in schools, or people want to fight against reparations, that, well, my ancestors didn't do that. Like, so I'll look at my own ancestors. Well, maybe they came from Germany in the 1860s to Minnesota, and they weren't slaveholders, so I'm off the hook. Or, you know, and then of course you start to uncover, well, what did my ancestors in St. Cloud, how did they interact with the indigenous peoples in the mid-19th century? But anyway, so long way of getting to my question. Do you run into, especially with younger conservatives, how do you feel like they're receiving some of the things that maybe you're bringing up in this book, or some of the ideas, and how, both like personal anecdotes, but also, you know, what you see in polling, and how do you feel like, what do you feel like reaches those people who want to say, well, this was someone else?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, what I think I see happening is, on the one hand, there is, I think, a reckoning happening. There are more churches today dealing with these issues than there ever has been before. So I'm 55. I was born in 1968, you know, I can certainly say in my adult lifetime, in observing kind of religion in America and Christianity in America, I mean, even 10 years ago, the marquee outside has the words white supremacy, right, on the marquee outside. And even 10 years ago, there are not many churches that would have put the words white supremacy on the marquee. If they had, it probably would have had a brick thrown through it, right, before the event happened. And I think that's actually a shift, that there are people willing to talk about it, there's a new vocabulary, I think, happening. There is a reckoning. There's also a doubling down on the other side, right? And so I think what there is less neutral ground. I think that may actually be a good thing, actually, to kind of make these issues come to the fore. And again, I think the other thing that is making it is not only the kind of the push from the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, that's kind of changed the consciousness, I think, over the last 5 to 7 years. But I also think the willingness, of local congregations like this to have this conversation, right? And I think I've probably been in, I mean, you've probably been in number 2. I think I've been in over 100 congregations who wanted to talk, like, we need to have the conversation about our stained glass windows and white Jesus in the stained glass windows. Or in Louisville, Kentucky, a Baptist church that had tributes to enslavers in their stained glass windows, right? And needing to reckon with that history, even though they were the founders of the congregation, right? And are kind of the vaunted, founders of the church and the history that the church has told of itself. But realizing, well, that's not exactly an honest history, right? And we have to do better. So I think there is this the backlash. You mentioned critical race theory and all of that, all those denials, the book bans. I really do see as a kind of desperation move to what is actually the wind moving forward, right? So it's ugly, and it may get uglier, I think. But I do think it's a sign that things are shifting, and so there is this reaction to things shifting. So.
That's what I think on my good days.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's, so you use this term, this desire to distance yourself from the sins of the past, and this is something I see entirely too frequently. And it's very interesting, because I'm a storyteller, I pay attention to how people tell their own stories. And when we talk about family histories, there's a very unique way that white people talk about family histories as opposed to Black and Indigenous people when they talk about family histories. And I want you to pay attention to this next time you hear someone telling the story of, their ancestral story. White people, a vast majority of the time, will use third-person pronouns when they are talking about the generations from the past. Black and Indigenous people will use first-person pronouns. And so I think it speaks, number one, to that wanting to distance the self, because it's not us, but they own slaves. It's not that we own slaves, it's they own slaves. But when, like for me as an Indigenous person, One of the things I say is I never walk into a room alone. I bring my ancestors with me. I am constantly conscious that I am here as a fulfillment of unimagined and unspoken dreams. But I bring my ancestors with me. And so I use those first-person pronouns. I mean, even when, so my tribe, the Stockbridge-Munsee Mohican Nation, we originated in the Hudson River Valley, is our ancestral homeland of upstate New York. So our history with the colonial experiment and white Christianity is as old, it's as old as colonial history in the Western world. You talk about your family Bible. My tribe has the second book ever printed in the Western Hemisphere, which is a Bible in the Mohican language and in English. So there's that long, long history. But even when I'm speaking about those generations from, the early 1600s, we speak of them as first person. So it's, and I think that, you are right. I mean, who wants to say we own slaves? Who wants to say we participated in genocide? Nobody does. So there's just this natural tendency to distance yourself, and it shows up in language. You talk about like this younger generation, this reckoning that's coming, and we're seeing that. I mean, we're seeing that here in Minneapolis on the streets. We're seeing that. One of the problems and what breaks my heart is that this younger generation is just abandoning the church altogether. Congregations all over the country are in decline, and for understandable reason. And so one of the things that I hope to do when I speak to churches is kind of like this prophetic voice. Don't abandon Christ, but redeem Christ. Like, Christ needs to be redeemed in our churches. Or I should say, the name of Christ, the image of Christ needs to be redeemed. We need to actually lean into what the gospel calls us to do. Because where we have gone wrong is really one of the times I most got in trouble behind a pulpit was I was speaking to an almost entirely white evangelical audience, and I held up my Bible and I said, "This is not written for you. You cannot understand the stories that are in here, because this is the story of an oppressed people that were trying to navigate their way through an oppressive system. And you as white Christians," and they happen to be suburban, so I called that out too, you as white suburban Christians, you don't know that oppression, so you can't know these stories. You're trying to sing freedom songs, and your hands have never been bound in chains. So your only hope is to sit and form relationships with marginalized people. And rather than do what Christianity in the Western world has always done with black and brown faces, you brought your Bible to those faces and you said, "Let me tell you what this says." It's totally wrong. What you need to do is bring your Bible to those marginalized community and ask them, "Will you tell me what this says?" Because you can't know the story. You can't sing freedom songs if you've never been bound in chains. And white Christians, I hate to tell you this, actually I don't hate to tell you this, I love to tell you this, white Christians, you have never been bound in chains. Not here, not in this country. So you can't know what the gospel says. And so I think the redemption for this separation of the name of Christ from white supremacy can only be done in humility. And you say on your best days you feel like that. I don't know if white Christianity is capable of that level of humility.
I'm going to jump in, follow on with a little James Baldwin here, who I should just say, Howard Thurman, James Baldwin have probably shaped, reformed my own theology more than certainly Augustine, Aquinas, any of those folks ever read in seminary. And one of the haunting things, I think convicting things, to kind of use an evangelical term in this space for my Baptist upbringing, was an interview that James Baldwin gave, and they asked him what African Americans thought of white people. And he said, well, we know them intimately. And in fact, the way he said, in the way that a mother knows her child. And he said, many times what we think is that we consider them the slightly mad victims of their own brainwashing. Which I think fits very well with what you're saying here, right? Is there's a mythology, right, that has kind of arisen that is, I think also Flannery Connery's were like called the South, Christ haunted, right? Not exactly Christ infused or Christ filled, but Christ haunted in the South. It has the kind of trappings of Christianity around it, but it's lost, I think, the message in the middle, and deeply lost the message. I think that's the kind of terrifying thing for me, and I think why I'm still writing books about this to figure it out, it is, I think, not entirely clear, if we're honest, where our commitments to white supremacy end and our commitments to Christ begin. Like they're that entangled. And they have been that entangled for centuries. And so I think it's a real challenge. If you take it seriously and you look in the mirror and hold the gaze long enough, and you think about that phrase, what does it take for somebody to come to sanity? And it's a long process in order to come to sanity. But it first takes looking in the mirror long enough to see it, right? And I think that's, in many ways, where we are. I think our generation has an opportunity, I think, if we'll take it, to look in the mirror long enough to see it and to just begin. Our children and our children's children are going to have to finish the job. But I think we've got the opportunity to kind of begin it.
I keep thinking about, as we're talking, the other line that you read about the minister's wife standing by the side and watching and saying, God have mercy on their souls. And thinking about what Reverend Jacobs was saying, coming from the perspective as a woman, right, there's certainly a maleness and a masculinity to white supremacy that is a part of what it is, and women have been both the beneficiaries and the victims of white supremacy, and have certainly aided and abetted, and absolutely, we see it in Lauren Boebert, we see it in Marjorie Taylor Greene, we see it in Governor Reynolds in Iowa. So I wonder, as you were doing this historical work and investigation, do you have any comment on the women's stories in the midst, and what do you see a particular role for white women in this work, both as recognizing our space sometimes as victims of this violence, and also recognizing our place as oppressors and abusers ourselves?
Yeah, it's complicated, right? Because I think what you're pointing to is right, that the people in power calling the shots, making these laws, passing the judgments are all men, all white men, historically speaking, and then you do have these voices of compassion. And the last part of that quote, right, is God have mercy on them, for they will find none from man, right, is the quote there. And she probably meant that in a more generic sense, but it was in this kind of gendered, language. And so there is that. And then on the other hand, as Ida B. Wells pointed out, the most dominant formula for a lynching in the U.S. is a white woman accusing a person of color of sexually assaulting her. And in fact, this is true in Duluth, right? What set off the mob of 10,000 people, a tenth of the population of the town at the time in Duluth, to come out and watch the lynching of 3 people was a woman named Irene Tuscan falsely accusing these African American men of sexually assaulting her at the circus that was in town for one day, right? And the other thing I think of on that side of the ledger too is one of the biggest farm, I'm from the South, and we still have, even after the removal of hundreds of them, I think a little more than 1,000 Confederate monuments still standing on public land in the South. And who put that up? It was the United Daughters of the Confederacy, right? That was the group. It was 100,000 women strong in its heyday in the early 1900s. So I think it's been a very complicated story. The one other thing I'll say on the other side is that this vision, though, that comes from this idea of European domination, that's about Christian domination and European domination, is a hierarchical worldview that absolutely has, Europeans over non-Europeans, Christianity over non-Christians, and men over women. Like, that is absolutely part of the formula, right? And we could extend it today to straight people over anyone who's not cisgender. All of these hierarchies are inherited, I think, from that worldview that has this divinely ordained pecking order.
There's a lot in the book, right? We got the theme that you're kind of walking through this, like showing us how this doctrine of discovery kind of continues to play out, and not just this papal bull that was made in the 1400s, but this is an ongoing living document in some ways. And that, like, how are you seeing this, still being played out in your own lives?
Oh, the doctrine of discovery?
Yeah.
Well,
Buckle up.
Judson Memorial owns this piece of property. The only thing that allows you to own that piece of property is the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery, this 15th century series of papal bulls, is the foundational legal framework by which private land ownership is allowed in the United States. And it's not just, the conservative justices who are trying to hold on to. So our own patron saint of liberal judicial minds, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, is the most recent citer of the doctrine of discovery from the Supreme Court bench. We've had, so probably around 2012, there was this big wave of congregations, both at the congregational level all the way up to national denominations, renouncing the doctrine of discovery. The ELCA has done it, the Presbyterians have done it, I think most recently the Evangelical Covenant has done it, but I mean, you can find, there's a list a mile long of denominations who have rescinded or renounced or repudiated the doctrine of discovery. And I remember in 2016, when the big protest at Standing Rock in North Dakota was taking place, and there was a call for clergy. So about 500 clergy people from all around the country, across this big ecumenical call, went and were really a very welcome presence there. But I remember a very good friend of mine who is a very activist clergy member here in the Twin Cities. She responded to this call. She went out there, and when I was not available, I couldn't go out there at the time, so I was living vicariously through all of my friends and colleagues who were out there. But she came back, and she's a white woman, and she came back and she talked about this beautiful moment where a subset of the clergy got together with some of the native hosts who were there, primarily the Lakota hosts who were there, and what they did is they actually had a print-off of these papal bulls, and they burned them there, in the prairie fields of Standing Rock. And she was telling me like how beautiful this is and everything. And I told her, I said, I'm glad that was meaningful for you, but that's not where you need to burn the doctrine of discovery. We already know that it's bogus. I said, take a stand. Come back to your church and burn the doctrine of discovery on the steps of your church. Do it here. Like, the repudiation of the doctrine of discovery does nothing for me. It's meaningless. You know, I mean, the ELCA has repudiated the doctrine of discovery. I remember speaking at the St. Paul, I'm not even Lutheran, and I was invited to speak at the St. Paul Synod gathering against the doctrine of discovery. I was speaking at that, and shortly thereafter it was repudiated. And guess what that's meant for me? Nothing.
Hopefully they paid you.
No, they didn't. The ELCA can be kind of cheap. But you know, the way they, you ask like, how is this still playing out? If you own a home, if you own property, you owe that privilege to the doctrine of discovery. And if you have signed on to repudiations of the doctrine of discovery and you are not currently wrestling with how that looks for private land ownership, then your repudiation is meaningless. There's no teeth to it.
I'll just add a little bit on that, and we'll confess, also I confess this in the book, that despite having a PhD in religion, despite going to seminary, like I might have heard the term, but it never clocked as something significant that set the moral compass, right, for all of how we have private property, and all these terms that like are so rampant in, you know, the way manifest destiny, a new Zion, a new promised land, a city, even a city set on a hill, like all of these metaphors, right, are just kind of reincarnations of this older idea that really boils down to this, right? And what was so striking to me once I read the documents, if you want to read them, there's doctrineofdiscovery.org has them all in Latin and they have them all in English. You can just read them for yourselves. It's between 1452 and 1493. But what's striking about them is just the moral logic of them, and it basically is like, because what happened is it's right the sort of particularly Spain and Portugal coming back and saying, yeah, what obligations do we have toward these people that we just found, right? And we need some moral guidance here, and they look to the church to provide it, and the church basically says, okay, well here's the criteria for who doesn't have human rights. Are they Christian? Like that's the criteria. And it basically says if you find lands that are not inhabited by Christians, they are to be considered enemies of Christ. That's the language in the document. And it goes on. It spells it out. You have the right to occupy the land, you have the right to steal their goods, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. Right? That's from the highest law of the land from the Christian church in the 15th century. And by the way, unless you all are thinking we're going to blame it on the Catholics, this is before the Protestant-Catholic split, right? And it's before the split with the Church of England and the Catholic Church. So this is the authority of all of Western Christendom speaking here. And it is the thing that sets off the transatlantic slave trade, the genocide of indigenous people, and I never clocked it, right, as something that like was at the center of like what went wrong.
Yeah. So as has been mentioned, you know, I do these sacred sites tours, and you and I had a conversation about this when we visited last, about when I started doing the tours, it was very informational. There was very little difference between what I provided and like if you went to Rome and hopped on a tour bus. You know, it would just be, that's what this is, here are the dates and all of this. But I wasn't having the impact that I really desired. I foolishly thought a dozen years ago when I started this that if I made white people smarter, then I was doing something. But so I incredibly like retooled how I did it. And I remember now, like under this kind of new model that I do, I had this one group, it was probably within the last 2 years, I had this group from a largely white church. And I don't, with good reason, I don't provide space for Q&A in that in that time. I don't provide time for discussion. You know, I'm telling a story. Your job is to go home and wrestle with it. I'm not your therapist. But one white man violated this protocol, as happens at times. And I had just gotten done, if you've been on the tour, I had just gotten done telling the story at the second site, the concentration camp, how I described it, the valley of Genesis and genocide. And we were at this time where I send people out to go process, go sit in the woods by yourself for 10, 15 minutes. But he didn't go. He went and came back early or something. And with a small group around, he walks up to me, and I can always tell when white people have a ridiculous question. You just get this look, okay? And I've been doing this long enough to read it. And he just says, I just had this question. Where was God in all of this? You know, and like we had just gone through the history of this place, and over 300 people died here in one winter. Mass starvation, you know, human degradation to unbelievable deaths. And he asked, where was God in this? And I know the question he was asking because I too went to seminary, right? And this is the Elie Wiesel in the concentration camp, where is God in the midst of human suffering kind of question. And I studied theology, so like that switch in my head, that theologian switch flipped on just for a second. I was about to answer, you know, in some apologist way, kind of getting God off the hook, right? But I turned that switch off, and I just looked at him, and almost with an amount of incredulity, I said, where was God in this? I said, all of this was done in the name of God. All of this was done in the name of God. You can't ask me where God was in the midst of this, because this was all done in God's name. And you know, I think you're right. You know, I mean, we're good contemporary Protestants, you know, and we're like, no, the doctrine of discovery came out of the Vatican, so it's not our problem. But like, this was all done in the name of God, and the harm and the trauma continues to be perpetuated in the name of God.
I was just listening, and hopefully I wasn't getting that look that you're not. I'm not going to ask you a question. We'll see. You can blame me later. But what I wanted to bring up is, as we're talking about all these things that happened so long ago in the doctrine of discovery, I know Robert was asked recently, like, how does all this connect to kind of the trending term right now, which is white Christian nationalism? And I think that's why that your work is so important and your work is so important, because people want to make Christian nationalism into a partisan issue, and that this is something that Democrats are saying that Republicans are doing, and it's all centered around Trump. But really, I think it's very important to root white Christian nationalism in America in 2023 in these same roots. You know, this is not a partisan topic. It's not about Donald Trump. As much as he sells books and he sells newspapers and he sells TV ads, you know, it's really the strains of white Christian nationalism. When you hear people advocating for an explicitly Christian Supreme Court, when you see the US Supreme Court ruling on behalf of a high school football coach who wanted to openly pray in the field, and by the way, they gave him his job back and he resigned the next day so he could go be a Fox News contributor. So at the bottom of all this, we got to, you know, follow the money, ultimately. But I do think it's really, really important to note that white Christian nationalism, in my Lutheran pastor hat, I'll say it's a form of the theology of glory. The theology of glory is what inspired the doctrine of discovery, this inherent, particularly European, white, male drive, but a human drive also for power. So I do think when we're thinking about Christian nationalism, it's all a part of this same milieu. And I think it's important when you're talking to people about Christian nationalism to note these deep historical roots, because it takes it out of this easily, you know, constructed partisan punditry discussion that too many of our national media have been continuing.
And just for all those non-Lutherans in the room, theology of glory versus...
Theology of the cross.
Thank you. Great.
It'll save us all.
Just to make sure I got the other side of the binary. Yeah.
And theology of the cross would basically say that God does
God's greatest power when it seems that things are at their worst. God's greatest power is exercised in the crucifixion when Jesus is dying. God's power is made manifest in weakness. All of these ideas that really what turns it upside down is where God's power is made most strong. The opposite of prosperity gospel.
All right, we are getting close to, an hour. We're here. What about some last words? You want to say, how about the panels, right? Everyone got a last word you want to say about this? Yeah.
Oh, no, I just talked to this. Well, we should have you go last.
All right, good. How about you?
Yeah. Pressure to come up with something profound.
You get in with a tagline that I stole from you. I stole and attributed to you in the book. That's a good one. He wraps up the chapter on Minnesota. He's got the last word.
Which I just found out today. No pressure. If I could just do a shameless plug. It's been mentioned, the work I do, particularly these sacred sites tours, indigenous spaces that are very close here in the Twin Cities. And I've been doing it for over 12 years. And I continue to do it because I believe in the power of this. I started doing these tours because about 15 years ago, I learned this history for the first time. And I felt a deep sense of shame. I was a native kid, grew up in the public school system here in the Twin Cities, knew nothing of these stories. I'm a native kid, and it might not mean anything to you, but if you're a person of color in this audience, you know that if you're black and it's Black History Month, your brain opens up a little more. You're learning this, and so I knew that it was never talked about because I knew nothing of it. Because if it had been talked about, I sure as heck would have remembered it. And I felt this sense of shame that I grew up here. I have lived here my entire life, and I knew nothing of this story. And so I sought to remedy that. I literally, I consider this a call. Certainly not the call I anticipated when I was growing up in the fundamentalist Pentecostal church that I grew up in. But this is the deepest sense of call that I have ever felt in my life. And I tell people it's important to do this because you owe it to the indigenous people of this land to at least know their story. You owe it to the indigenous people to at least know their story. And so, that's why I do this work. I do this work because when you get in these sites, and Robert and others who have been on this can attest, there's a magic that happens when you're hearing the story and your feet are literally planted in the soil where that story took place. I get asked if I can take my storytelling outside of those sites, bring them into a classroom or a church basement, and I say, no, I can't, because I'll lose the magic. I can't. And so, that's why I do this work. It's this deep sense of call. It's because, even as an indigenous person, I'm not indigenous to Minnesota. My people come from 1,200 miles to the east, and we are now 250 miles to the east in the middle of Wisconsin, thanks to some federally mandated relocation programs in the 19th century. But but I'm living here now. I grew up here, and like, how hypocritical of me if I don't know the stories of where I am, and I think it's important, and so you read Robert's book and you hear about, the way he describes the lynchings in Duluth. Go to Duluth, put your feet on those sites. Try to imagine a crowd of 10,000 people in those intersections and in those plazas, He also describes the largest execution in United States history in Mankato, the day after Christmas, the morning after Christmas in 1862. That was a crowd of 5,000 people. I mean, just think about that. It's Mankato. I mean, honestly, it's Mankato in 1862. It's the morning after Christmas. And there's 5,000 people that show up for this. Put your feet in that soil and just try to imagine. I think as historians, that's what comes alive to us, is when we can just put our feet in these sacred places and just, I think it brings another level of lament. Like it makes lament that much more real.
Well, I want to thank you for doing that work. Your reputation precedes you, and also, I'm sure you're tired, because sometimes people just know of somebody's name, and there's a lot of people watching and kind of thinking, oh, that's really good work, but nobody ever tells you that. And then everybody, when they're mad, they do tell you. So I hope you feel, or I want you to know, that there's many, unfortunately, characteristic of a lot of white Minnesota Lutherans is we silently support you. So, just a quick last word. Robert brought up the decline in church attendance and the loss of trust in the institutional church for many very valid reasons, particularly among younger people. So the last word I do want to say, I want you, specifically as those of you who are here from Judson Church, Pastor, to also be proud of your local church, proud that you've provided this venue tonight, even though we're on stolen land. Proud that you have provided this space for this discussion, that you've brought Robert here tonight. And I often have these conversations with people my age about, as much as we feel betrayed by the local church and by the church in general, there's still this kernel, this treasure in clay jars in the local church. There's still hope for the kinds of groups that can gather in local churches that I don't see gathering anywhere else. So I want to affirm you as this tonight as a part of the ministry of the local church, and to more broadly see beyond sort of the budget or the worship attendance to see the impact that local churches continue to have.
Well, I just want to thank you for that. And yes, I want to echo what Angela said about when I was just in Harrisburg with a set of churches that are actually doing a very similar thing about learning their own history in Harrisburg, right? And we went on a bus and we went around town and we're like, here is where all the African American, there were like about 10, 12 blocks of African American part of town mowed down to make room for the new Capitol. Right, and then talking about whose lands were these before all of that happened, right? And really trying to get all the way down. I sometimes feel like my son is 13, and there was a while he was very into Pokemon, and there was that enhanced reality thing. I don't know if any of you saw it with kids or grandkids, where you could hold your phone up and you could see like Pikachu on sitting on the pew over there. If you hold your phone up like this, it would transpose like a kind of augmented reality onto what you were seeing through the lens of your phone. And I feel like this work has sort of done that to my vision. now, right? That when I walked from the Moxie Hotel in Uptown down here, and looking at the street names, right? Looking at the river names, and you could see, right? I mean, the way I put it in the book is like the evidence of the crimes are all around us, right? And we just walk past them every day and don't really pay attention to them. And so I think one thing it's done for me is kind of given me this multi-layered sense of where I'm at, right? And I think there's like there's all this lamenting, particularly like making white people uncomfortable, right? I'm going to go back to where you started, right? I mean, certainly, there's nothing in the gospel saying that, or was that you who said that about taking your cross? Yes, and be comfortable, right? That's not really there that I've seen. But the sense, I wrote a thing, and I called it the sacred gift of white discomfort. Because I really felt like, I felt like for me, that's what it has been. It's been a gift, right? Because it's allowed me to see things differently. And back to that slightly mad victims of our own brainwashing thing, I think I feel like I'm finally moving toward health, right? Toward integrity, right? Something that I can actually like stand on and not wince and not hope I don't dig too long or don't look too under that rug, or there's just not any of that anymore. And I think that there's a real liberty in that, right? And we have this like platitude, you will know the truth and the truth will make you free, and we kind of just throw that around, right? But I think it's actually quite a difficult saying if we take it seriously. This process of first like vision, seeing things differently, that then leads to, I think, confession and repentance, right? And redemption at the end of the day, right? But there's a process, and I so feel like we are just so, we white Christians now, I'm saying, so at the very beginning of that process, right? So at the very beginning. We're even just the seeing, we're not even in confession yet, really. I mean, it's just like the seeing part, we're still trying to get right. But I hope that, there's a way in which we all, certainly I have seen this like in my own life, that there's a freedom in it, right? And a liberation in it from this bondage of this mythology of impossible innocence. This like children's story that we have told ourselves about ourselves, right? And even that's not innocent, right? We do that to use it, right? To hold on to power. And so I think just kind of getting clear about that is really the project, again, of our generation. And it really just boils down, I'll kind of leave it with this clarity, I think I've kind of gotten. I'm kind of wrestling with the doctrine of discovery and thinking about where we are with democracy today. That really what we have, and it's really come to the fore, I think, because of the demographic changes in the country, that white Christians don't have such a super majority that they can just like mow everybody down with sheer numbers and power now, and there are other voices that are able to get to the fore. But we really have this question we've never resolved in American history, and it essentially is this: like, are we on the one hand this old story? Are we a divinely ordained promised land for European Christians? Like, is that what these lands are for, and who they are for? Or are we a pluralistic democracy, right, where everybody stands on equal footing before the Constitution? And those two things are mutually incompatible with one another. And I think we've never really been answering. And I think, where we are today and why the fights are not really about policy. Even when they're about policy, they're about identity, really. And we're really fighting over identity and who we are. And I think it's because we've never answered that question. And I think that's the question we're being called to answer today.
Well, everyone, have a round of applause. Thank you for Appreciate you for sharing who you are, and the stories of what you have, and thank you for just being present and being who you are in this world as a witness. How about this? Let's give Dan just a little bit of time, to kind of, shake the wiggles out, all that kind of stuff, yeah. And Rob will be in the back. Books for sale. We've got refreshments. Please take some, right? Enjoy them. Meet a neighbor. Things you got going on. Another thing I want to let you about is on October 19th. There is a documentary that will be, not the premiere, but will be the second premiere. Yeah, Border of Dreams. It is a documentary that some students and faculty at Bethel University made about some people that coming from south of the border, coming to America. One of them goes back, and it's this wonderful story, 2 parallel tracks, and really what is the Christian response to really wrestle with in this story. So that'll be October 19th at 7 p.m. All right, we got books in the back, and we are...
Can I do one more plug?
Yeah.
So first of all, I'm going to do Church on the Move.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yes,
sure,
we
sure.
have read Church on the Move. You should. Red State Christians. We have Red State Christians. Yes, you can do that. And Angela and I are both on Substack, which is a newsletter platform. You can Google us both with Substack. We both have Substack newsletters coming out. We'd love to have you all as readers. And Jim Bear, people can actually financially support the work you're doing, right? Do you want to say how they can do that before we go?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I do this work through my office at the Minnesota Council of Churches, and if you go to the Minnesota Council of Churches, which is mnchurches.org, the organization that I run this work through is called Healing Minnesota Stories. It's a little drop-down menu. You can donate through there.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Yeah, let's go.
I love it. I know people that are acting in it, so Spirit. So that's Dallas Gold. From yeah.
So, what's your first name? I can tell my sister.
My first name was Linnell.
Linnell.
Yeah, I see the family resemblance. How many sisters? How many siblings?
I have 3 sisters, 2 sisters and a son and a brother.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I did call me. She's Linnell. So, what is the first name again?
Linnell.
So, she know Linnell?
Yeah, she knows. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's not. I occasionally run into other ones. So,
Yeah.
Lynnell. And what is your first name again?
Grace.
Great. Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, I'm married. Yeah, so what's it called? Linden Hills and Episcopal, like what they call it.
I'm glad. One of my neighbors came over, so now I have a ride back. My husband dropped me off because he was going someplace else.
Oh, yeah.
That's great.
So this is a Baptist church, but it's a Baptist church.
It's an American Baptist church. Oh, it's a Baptist church. The biggest. And the American Baptist was a split in Civil War. And so American Baptists tend to be more to the left. But every other Baptist is back. So I would give Bethel is a Baptist church conference with a Swedish Baptist.
So it didn't work in American Baptist.
No, Swedish Baptist was. It used to be.